He laughed into the microphone and said, "She's emotional. You know how women like that are." And the room actually laughed with him. My ears rang, my face went hot, and for a second I genuinely thought I might stand up and embarrass myself further. Instead, I sat there frozen, realizing this wasn't an accident, this was planned. People turned to look at me, not with concern, but curiosity, like they were waiting to see what kind of woman I was going to be. I felt my hands shaking in my lap and pressed my nails into my palm under the table. I told myself, if you react, you lose control of the story. Someone behind me whispered, "Did he really just say that?" And someone else replied, "Well, he's not wrong." That hurt more than his words. It was the moment I understood that humiliation isn't loud, it's collective. He glanced at me after, smirking slightly, clearly expecting tears or a confrontation. I forced my face into something neutral, even though my chest felt tight and wrong. The moment stretched, and when I didn't give him what he wanted, his smile flickered. At the cocktail table, a woman I barely knew leaned over and said, "You're handling this very well," in that tone people use when they expect you not to. I smiled and said, "I don't have a choice," because I didn't. Inside, I was cataloging everything: who avoided my eyes, who stared, who looked uncomfortable. He came up beside me and said quietly, "Don't make this bigger than it needs to be." I nodded like I agreed, even though my throat burned with things I wanted to say. I realized then that he didn't see me as hurt. He saw me as a risk to manage. Later, during the charity auction, he made another comment, this time framed as a joke about how I overthink. A few people laughed automatically, but not everyone did. I noticed who didn't. I laughed too, lightly, like I was in on it, even though my stomach twisted. The sound surprised me. It sounded normal, almost pleasant. That was the moment I understood that calm can confuse people more than anger. In the temple corridor afterward, incense thick in the air, he pulled me aside and said, "You're being dramatic." I wanted to scream that he had humiliated me, but instead I said, "I'm actually very calm," and meant it more than I expected to. He stared at me like he didn't know which version of me he was dealing with anymore. I could see him recalculating, deciding whether to push or retreat. That hesitation felt like oxygen. That night, alone in the bathroom, I cried silently into a towel so no one would hear. I let myself feel everything, the rage, the embarrassment, the fear, because I knew if I didn't, it would leak out later when it mattered most. Strength isn't pretending it doesn't hurt. It's choosing where it hurts. At the next board meeting, he interrupted me twice. The third time, I stopped speaking completely and just looked at him, waiting. The room went quiet, and someone else finally said, "Let her finish." I felt my heart pounding as I continued, my voice steady but my legs weak under the table. I didn't say anything brilliant, I just said the truth clearly. When I finished, no one rushed to fill the silence. Afterward, one of the senior partners pulled me aside and said, "You're more composed than I would have been." I nodded, unsure whether that was praise or a warning. Either way, I filed it away. At my cousin's wedding, surrounded by music and laughter, he tried to act like nothing had happened between us. He leaned in and joked, "Don't look so serious, people will talk." I smiled and walked away mid-sentence, my hands shaking slightly as I did. During the mehendi ceremony, I noticed people watching us from across the courtyard. Someone whispered my name, then his. I realized then that people weren't judging me anymore, they were observing him. Later, he confronted me and said, "You're being distant on purpose." I looked at him and said, "I'm just listening more," which wasn't a lie. He didn't like that answer. At the next gala, he introduced a business associate I knew had a questionable reputation and waited for my reaction. I gave none. I could feel his frustration radiating toward me like heat. A junior colleague pulled me aside later and whispered, "I thought it was just me he talked to like that." My chest tightened, not with victory, but recognition. Patterns don't stay hidden forever. That night, sitting in my car before driving home, I realized something had shifted. I wasn't trying to prove I was right anymore. I was just letting people see who he was, at his own pace. After that conversation in the car, I stopped rehearsing arguments in my head. Instead, I started listening, really listening to how people spoke about him when they thought he wasn't around. The cracks were already there. I just hadn't noticed how long they'd been forming. At a charity planning meeting, he over-explained a simple decision and snapped when someone asked a follow-up. The room went quiet in that uncomfortable way where no one defends you, but no one attacks either. I sat there thinking, so it's not just me. Later, a woman I'd only exchanged polite smiles with before leaned over and said, "He gets like that when he feels cornered." It wasn't sympathy exactly, more like confirmation. I nodded slowly, feeling something in my chest finally loosen. He started watching me more closely after that, like he was waiting for me to make a move. I didn't. The more still I became, the more restless he seemed. At a Diwali gathering, someone asked him a harmless question about a delayed project, and he laughed it off too quickly. I noticed how a few people exchanged looks, subtle but unmistakable. Those looks mattered more than any confrontation. He tried to joke with me afterward, saying, "You see what I deal with?" Like we were allies again. I smiled politely and said, "Everyone's under pressure," then excused myself. I could feel his irritation follow me across the room. That night, lying in bed, I replayed everything and realized how different this felt from before. I wasn't bracing myself for his moods anymore. I was just watching. At the next board meeting, he interrupted someone else the way he used to interrupt me. This time, the chair cleared his throat and said, "Let's let her finish." I looked down at my notes so no one would see the small, shocked smile trying to form. After the meeting, he stormed past me without a word. I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. I hadn't wanted him humiliated, I just wanted him exposed. A junior analyst stopped me in the hallway and said, "I didn't think anyone noticed how he talks to people." Her voice was quiet, almost apologetic. I told her honestly, "I think people notice more than they admit." At a wedding reception, music thumping and lights low, he tried to corner me again. "You've changed," he said, not accusingly, but not kindly either. I shrugged and replied, "I had to." He looked like he wanted to argue, but didn't know how without drawing attention. For the first time, I realized how much he relied on privacy to maintain control. Public spaces were no longer safe for him. Over dinner, I overheard someone say, "He's been off lately," and someone else respond, "Yeah, I've noticed." They didn't lower their voices when I passed. That felt intentional. I stopped explaining myself to people who asked vague questions about tension. I just said, "Things change," and let them interpret that however they wanted. Ambiguity protected me. At another gala, he gave a speech that should have impressed everyone. Instead, it felt rehearsed and defensive. I could see people shifting in their seats, waiting for it to end. Someone clapped too early by mistake, and the moment fell flat. I felt secondhand embarrassment and immediately felt guilty for it. Still, I didn't intervene. Later that night, a senior woman pulled me aside and said, "You handled everything with a lot of restraint." I wanted to tell her how much restraint costs, but I just thanked her. Some things don't need to be explained. He stopped trying to talk to me after that. Not dramatically, just small, careful avoidance. It felt like standing in sunlight after being indoors too long. At a temple visit with family, an elder asked him a direct question about finances. He stumbled, laughed, then deflected. I watched the elder's expression change, just slightly. No one looked at me during that exchange, and that was the point. I wasn't part of it anymore. His behavior was standing on its own. Driving home that evening, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired but lighter. The kind of tired you feel after surviving something. A month later, I was asked to lead a small initiative. He wasn't. No announcement, no explanation, just a shift. That was when it really sank in. He congratulated me stiffly in front of others. "You deserve it," he said, and I believed he meant it in the only way he could. I thanked him and moved on. People started coming to me for advice, not gossip. I listened carefully, aware of how easily power can change someone if they stop paying attention to themselves. I refused to become what had hurt me. At another wedding, someone joked, "You're very hard to read," and I laughed genuinely. That used to bother me. Now it felt like armor. I saw him across the room that night, quieter than before, less certain. For a moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy. Then I remembered how alone I'd felt when it mattered. We never had a final confrontation. No dramatic apology. No closure conversation. Just distance, clarity, and consequences settling into place. One evening, a younger woman asked me how I stayed calm when people tried to provoke me. I told her the truth. I wasn't calm. I just learned when not to show it. That answer stayed with me longer than I expected. It reminded me how often women are praised for endurance instead of protected from harm. I decided not to romanticize what I survived. At the final gala of the year, I stood on stage briefly to speak. My voice was steady, not because I wasn't nervous, but because I trusted myself now. Applause filled the room, and for once, I didn't scan the crowd to see how he was reacting. I didn't need to. The moment belonged to me. Later, someone mentioned his name casually and changed the subject just as casually. That's how relevance fades, not with scandal, but with indifference. Driving home, I thought about how badly I'd wanted justice in the beginning. What I got instead was clarity. It was quieter, but it lasted. I realized I hadn't raised my voice once, but my life had still changed direction. That mattered to me. It meant I didn't have to become louder to be heard. If you're listening to this and wondering whether staying quiet means you're weak, I want you to hear this clearly. Silence can be a choice, not a surrender. Observation teaches you things confrontation never will. People reveal themselves when you stop interrupting them. Boundaries don't always look like ultimatums. Sometimes they look like distance, restraint, and no longer explaining yourself. You don't owe emotional access to people who misuse it. You don't owe reactions to people who thrive on them. I didn't win by destroying him. I won by refusing to participate in his version of reality. And if you're in a room right now where someone is trying to humiliate or control you, pause before you respond. Notice who's watching. Notice who's uncomfortable. Notice who says nothing. Your calm might feel invisible in the moment. It isn't. It's being recorded in people's minds. Compared against someone else's behavior, wait quietly. Let time do the work. You don't need to rush. Not every lesson needs to be taught loudly. Not every truth needs your voice to survive. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stay long enough for everyone to see. I did. And when they finally did, I was already gone. At peace. Whole. Unapologetic. If this story felt familiar, you're not alone. And if you're still in the middle of it, be patient with yourself. Clarity comes before freedom. Silence comes before understanding. And self-respect always comes before closure. You don't need the last word. You need the last choice. So choose yourself, even quietly, because sometimes that's the loudest victory there is.